This video will cover the replacement of rear trailing arms and bushings on a 1990 Volvo 240. Best case scenario, this can be completed in a day. Worst case scenario, plan on being without the car for a few days. For example, this passenger side bushing decided to reenact the Arthurian legend of the Sword and Stone, taking nearly 6 hours before it dislodged itself from its housing. Proceed at your own masochistic whims. Quick note, always replace bushings in pairs and never replace just one side. Jack your car and place jack stands at the rear jacking points. Allow the rear axle to float freely, but keep a jack just underneath the rear differential as an additional safety. Remove the spring by loosening the nut on the underside of the trailing arm. To fully remove the spring, you may have to lower the jack to allow the rear axle to drop for clearance. Disconnect the shock absorber at its top and bottom mounts. The bottom mount also shares a support for the rear anti-sway bar, which has an additional point of contact on the trailing arm a few inches to the rear. Once the shock, spring, and anti-sway bar are disconnected, proceed to disconnecting the trailing arm via its two mounting locations. I unseated the front bushing connecting to the chassis, and then the rear bushing connecting to the axle. The reverse may be easier as I had to still stabilize the front while unscrewing the rear. To remove the front screw, I had to apply heat to both sides with a butane torch to remove the factory undercoating before the screw would dislodge. The rear screw did not require this treatment. Once unseated, remove, inspect, and compare with your new trailing arm. Next is to remove the rear bushings. To do this, you will need Volvo Tool 5078 and Spacer 5079 or homemade equivalents. The individual components of Volvo Tool 5078 are stamped with corresponding letters. To prevent the axle ears from collapsing, attach the spacer to the bushing so that it sits in between the welded posts. Place sleeve B on the center-facing side of the bushing, capped with adapter A and nut. Insert the threaded bolt through the bushing from the inside. I recommend soaking this rod with oil before using. Thread adapter C and nut onto the bolt on the brake-facing side of the bushing. Adapter C can be identified by its diameter, which is the same as the bushing. Make sure that the adapter is flush and centered with the bushing before tightening. This adapter will trail the bushing through the housing as it's removed. Remove the bushing by torquing the center-facing nut until the bushing is released from the outermost ear and easily slides out towards the center of the car. Now, I am unsure if this is the norm, but my bushings were incredibly difficult to dislodge. I installed my tool, applied torque until considerable resistance was met, removed the tool, and either tapped it with a hammer, heated with a butane torch, or soaked with oil until the bushing dislodged. The passenger side bushing was of a particular nuisance, so I made an incision with a saw to compromise the integrity of the bushing before I reapplied the tool. The Volvo Green Book recommends using an impact wrench, which may expedite this process. A quick note on using the bushing tool. If you are torquing the nut and see no movement of the bushing or threaded rod, stop and loosen the tool. If you continue torquing without seeing movement, the tension will build up somewhere else in the tool, either seizing the nut or bending the threaded rod. I went through several 8-inch sections of half-inch threaded rods for this replacement. If anyone has any tips on easing this process, feel free to leave a message in the comment section. Once the bushing is removed, inspect and compare with your new bushings. This particular Volvo must have been a Monday car at the Gothenburg factory in Sweden, as upon inspection I discovered that the bushings were indeed installed upside down, which may have attributed to their premature failure. Before installation, inspect the mounting surface and remove any unwanted debris. To install your new bushing, orient the bushing so that the down arrow faces the ground and that the rubber recesses are facing front and back. If you do not see a down arrow, the bottom of the bushing can be identified by having more rubber than the top. Notice that the bushing has tapered and flared ends. Insert the bushing from the center of the car through the axle ears, tapered end first towards the brake, until you encounter resistance. Once the bushing is hand-seated, reapply your bushing tool in the opposite direction of removal, so that adapter A is on the brake side and that adapter D or C is on the center side. Attach the spacer to the bushing so that it sits in between the welded posts. Torque the tool from the brake side to seat the bushing. Once resistance is encountered, stop and remove your tool. You should have equal amounts of the bushing on either sides of the ears. Resecure your new trailing arm via the leading bushing first and then secure the rear bushing. Do not fully tighten the nuts until the car has been lowered, bounced, and settled so as to avoid straining the bushings. Once both trailing arms are secure, reattach your springs, anti-sway bar, and shock absorbers. At this point, it might be advantageous to replace the spring retention plates with new components. I did notice that the inner width of the new MTC trailing arms was smaller than the original arms, so that my shock absorber and spacer no longer fit together. To accommodate a proper fit, I gradually sanded the lower ends of the shock absorber. Once everything is secure, reattach your wheels, lower your car, and drive it onto a pair of ramps. Fully tighten the front and rear nuts on the trailing arms to 85 foot-pounds, the top and bottom nuts for the shock absorber to 65 foot-pounds, and the lower spring nut to 15 foot-pounds. Tighten the wheel lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds and take the car for a drive. After a few miles, drive the car back onto the ramps, double-check your mounts, and retighten as needed. After that, you're all done. Enjoy your Volvo 240.